Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar on alleviating moral suffering. Next slide, please. This webinar is sponsored by the Northeastern Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or MHTTC, housed at Rutgers School of Health Professions, Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. My name is Kati, and I'm the project coordinator of this center. And we'll be co-facilitating this webinar today with my colleague, PJ Wenger. MHTTC is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health and other related workforces to deliver evidence-based and empirically supported practices to individuals with mental illnesses. Please visit the MHTTC Network website for more information at mhttcnetwork.org. Next slide, please.
Okay.
If you're interested in staying up to date with the events and products the Northeastern Caribbean MHTTC is providing, please sign up to receive our email communications. You can sign up at the bit.ly link provided on the screen. Next slide, please. Following the webinar, you'll be asked to complete a brief survey. We value this feedback and use it to improve our activities and inform future activities. The surveys are also important because our continued funding is linked to the completion of these surveys, so we thank you in advance for your feedback. Next slide. We also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website along with the PowerPoint slide in the next couple of days. We encourage you to interact with our presenters during the webinar by using the chat feature. Please post any comments or questions you have in the chat, and I will collect your questions as we go and ask them of the presenter during the Q&A time towards the end of the presentation. During the webinar, our presenter may pose questions to you, so please use the chat feature to answer these questions. Next slide. This presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. All material appearing in this presentation, except that taken from copyrighted sources, is in the public domain and may be reproduced or copied without permission from SAMHSA or the authors. Citation of the source is appreciated. The opinions expressed herein are the views of the presenters and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. No official support or endorsement of DHHS, SAMHSA for the opinions described in this presentation is intended or should be inferred. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague PJ, who will be introducing our webinar presenter for today.
Welcome, everyone. We are so pleased to have Dr. Kenneth Doka back with us today. In case you missed our first presentation by Dr. Doka last week, Dr. Doka is a professor emeritus at the College of New Rochelle and senior consultant to the Hospice Foundation of America. Dr. Doka has extensive experience in the area of grief, is a prolific author and speaker, providing keynote addresses internationally. He participates in the annual Hospice Foundation of America teleconference and has appeared on CNN and Nightline. So we have a star in our midst. In addition, he has served as a consultant to medical, nursing, funeral service, and hospice organizations, as well as businesses and education and social service agencies. Dr. Doka was elected president of the Association for Death Education and Counseling in 1993. In 1995, he was elected to the board of directors of the International Work Group on Dying, Death, and Bereavement and served as chair from 1997 to 1999. The Association for Death Education and Counseling presented him with an award for outstanding contributions in the field of death education in 1998 and significant contribution to the field of thanatology in 2014. In 2000, Scott and White presented him an award for outstanding contributions to thanatology and hospice. His alma mater, Concordia College, presented him with their first Distinguished Alumnus Award. He is a recipient of the Caring Hands Award, as well as the Dr. Robert Fulton CDEB Founders Award. In 2006, Dr. Doka was grandfathered in as a mental health counselor under New York State's first licensure of counselors. In addition, Dr. Doka is an ordained Lutheran minister. So with that, Dr. Doka, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, and I'm so pleased to be with you today. My only regret is that we're not together personally. But I enjoy being with you today, even under Zoom. What I'm going to be talking about today is alleviating moral suffering. And I want to talk about it, alleviating moral suffering, not just in the lives of others, but in our own, since this is a condition that often is encountered by first responders, as we'll see, as well as those in any helping profession. So we want to look at that today. And moral suffering can be defined as the anguish that varied professionals experience in response to various forms of moral adversity. And I'm taking this from Rushton, such as moral harms, wrongs, or failures, unrelieved moral stress, that in some way imperil our own sense of integrity, professional integrity, and personal integrity. And there are various forms and types of moral suffering that arise from a number of different sources, including witnessing, participating, or directly precipitating situations that produce a series of negative moral outcomes. And as I said earlier, it's the kinds of reactions that are often experienced by frontline professionals, including emergency personnel, police, military, healthcare, mental health professionals, anybody who's really in the helping professions. And what we want to look at a little bit more carefully is three different types of ways to describe variations of moral suffering. And these would include moral distress, what's called moral injury, and then what Glassman calls soul injury. So let's look at each of these separately. Jameton described moral distress as the inner conflicts experienced by healthcare professionals when they experience personal, professional, spiritual, or ethical dilemmas in the provision of patient care. A number of years ago, I was asked to do an ethical grand rounds, and it was at a nursing home in New York City. And what had happened in that nursing home is there was a client, a much older woman, a woman well into her 90s, who had been really a trailblazing attorney and judge. She had broken in those days, remember, she was born in early 1900. This was actually she was born in the late 1800s. But she began to practice in the early 1900s, around 1920, 1930. And she was really a trailblazer. She was a woman evidently of great intelligence. She had been the first woman accepted as a partner at a prestigious law firm at a time when most women were rarely hired by these kinds of law firms. She broke barriers as a judge and in a series of different ways. By the time she was in the nursing home, she was well into her late 80s, and she had dementia. And she had the best, and you could see her brilliance because she wrote her own advanced directives. And having seen lots of advanced directives over the years, these advanced directives were just incredible. They were like contingency charts. So they'd say, if I have this and this happens, do this. And if I have this, I mean, there was almost no area that was untouched or no area that was left unclear. You could really see her former brilliance before she succumbed to dementia. And one of the things she made very clear is she said, if I have this stage of dementia, and she put a couple of other conditions in it, I develop an infection, and she listed a number of different infectious diseases, including pneumonia. She said, I choose not to be treated. So, about 5 years into the nursing home, she did develop pneumonia. The family wanted to follow her recommendations and allow her to die peacefully. And it went to the ethics committee of that particular home, and the ethics committee agreed. But then there became an uproar in the staff. And what had happened is that this woman in her dementia thought everyone who was taking care of her was family. And she treated the staff like that. So, if a nurse's aide went down to tuck her in at night, she would pat the aide's cheek or give her a kiss on the cheek and say, you are such a wonderful daughter. You are such a caring son. And by the way, just to make it clear, her own family was very caring and very present. But remember, they were grieving the woman who was this brilliant attorney and the matriarch of their family. The staff were grieving the woman that they knew, a woman who had advanced dementia, who was loving and lovely and caring and all these kinds of things. So when they didn't treat her, the staff really was in an uproar. And so I was asked to do this kind of moral grand rounds, I guess ethical grand rounds, you might call it. And I presented on the importance of autonomy. And I'll tell you how I think about that a little bit differently a little bit later on. And that these were her clear wishes. They were very, very clear. The family was very clear about it. And as I finished proudly my presentation, thinking I had put this issue to rest, the first hand that went up was the senior nurse. And she said, if it's so ethical, why do I feel so damn bad? And that really started an ethical journey for me as well. And I moved from what we might call a more a state of really respecting autonomy to a different ethical stance that one of my co-authors and a very prominent ethicist, Bruce Jennings, calls the ecological model, which is you can't make ethical decisions in a vacuum, and you have to make ethical decisions in terms of its influence and its impact on the larger community that also needs to be taken into account in this ethical decision making. I don't know that that would have made any difference in this case, but I think what we would have done had I followed that ethic and knew about that ethic at that time is at least made the process more inclusive, maybe create some dialogues between family and staff, to do something to acknowledge the distress that was experienced within the community. I always give as an example of that. I have what I think are pretty good advance directives, but I chose as my, and I just can't think of the word, as my proxy, my healthcare proxy, my, what do you call it, advocate, or I just can't think of the name today, but I chose as the person who holds my healthcare proxy, my son. I strongly suspect that my son will keep me alive longer than I would probably want to be. But, I thought, and I have a friend who would probably follow my wishes to the T. But I felt, having read Bruce Jennings and having written with him on this, that I don't want the last message to my son to be that I don't really trust you to make this decision. I want the last message to my son to be, I really put my life in your hands. I love you, and I put my life in your hands. And if I live a little bit longer than I think I should have, well, we all make sacrifices for our kids. I often joke that the call I've learned to dread from my son and my daughter-in-law, and now my grandchildren, is since they live so close, they live 3/4 of a mile away, is the question that starts out, "Are you home? Are you around today?" And then inevitably there's a request for a chore. And I always joke about that when I go through this story, because my son always seems to have different chores for me if I'm around. And one day he said to me, "Dad, I believe in an afterlife, but when you die, and if there is one, try to send some kind of signal back." And I thought, gee, even when I die, I have to deal with chores that I still have left undone. So I always joke about that. So what are some sources of moral distress? Well, one is simply the belief that one is causing some kind of harm, that maybe it's making somebody sicker or problematic. It could be the belief that medical care is futile. Why are we providing this care? It's not going to really change things. It's painful for the patient. It might be a disagreement with the decision to withdraw life-sustaining treatment, as it was in the case that I just mentioned. We can experience moral distress if we see that there's inadequate pain management, if we disregard patient choices, or if there's a lack of informed consent, or we don't even realize the issue of informed consent. It can be an issue if you're objectifying the patient, where staff members feel that the patient's personal respect is not being given, and the patient just becomes an object of care. I always remember when I was working in pediatrics as a chaplain, a physician coming into a 7-year-old boy, never saying hello to that little boy. He had leukemia, coming in with a grand rounds, picking up the boy's shirt, pointing to his spleen and saying, "Notice the spleen." He was a good physician, but didn't always have what we call a great bedside manner. But one of the things I have to give him credit for is that he was very interested in trying to improve it. He knew that was a constant complaint. And so he always asked staff and was very open to other staff saying, you could have handled that one a little different. So happily, I was able to talk to him and remind him that the spleen's name was Johnny. In any case, another reaction could be vicarious grief. And vicarious grief is a term that was coined by my mentor, Robert Kastenbaum. And Robert and Kastenbaum said, that often what happens, and by the way, please forgive me for that ping you may hear periodically. It's the sound that my email makes when it comes on, and I've tried every which way to turn it off, and people have told me different ways. Even people in seminars have told me different ways, and nothing seems to work. So we'll just have to tolerate that occasional ping. But here's the thing: is that often medical staff knows a lot more and has a more realistic notion of prognosis than the patient does. And so, so the patient may grieve about the likely course and outcome, even as the family and the patient continue to hope. And, and you may say somebody has late stage pancreatic cancer and the family saying, we're praying for a miracle. We know that somehow he's going to get through this, and you're looking ahead and that's not likely to happen. And this is what the family is likely to experience. And this creates a moral dilemma. Do you really be honest with the family and say, I'd love to think that's the case, but it's probably not likely. And if there are things you ought to say and things that you ought to do before this patient dies, this may be a good time to consider that. Or is your role simply to, be quiet and let the family maintain hope? And that's a dilemma we often experience in medical care. And again, think particularly of the moral suffering and distress that's being caused by our present pandemic. In many factors in this situation have really influenced and really affected of us. It's exacerbated moral distress. It's exacerbated moral suffering. Sometimes, at least early on, less so now, we had to ration care, and we had limitations on care. We had limitations on visits and isolation, particularly earlier on. And again, that still hasn't fully changed, but it often meant that the patients looked for increased reliance and support from healthcare staff since their families were limited. And again, other personnel, such as chaplains, such as community clergy, such as social workers, were inhibited by this sense of isolation from fulfilling their own sense of professional practice. So, they had a sense that they weren't doing the job that they were trained to do. And of course, that was creating distress. And how does that caregiver distress manifest itself? Well, high turnover, absenteeism, low morale, sometimes staff conflict, sometimes over-involvement and over-investment, spillover where you're taking your work issues home and your home issues to work, and then often a lot of guilt and a lot of anger, just at the whole situation of that. So, so this becomes an example of what moral distress can do to us. Moral injury is slightly different, but it all refers to this kind of, it's all an aspect of moral suffering. Here, there's an injury to an individual's sense of morality. Often results from perceived moral transgression that leads to a sense of emotional shame or moral distress. In traumatic or unusually stressful circumstances, people may perpetrate or fail to prevent or witness events that contradict deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. And again, it could be an act of commission when they do something that they feel they shouldn't have had to do, or an act of omission when they're not allowed or not permitted, or for one reason or another can't seem to do something they really felt they should do. In the case that I just mentioned of that older judge, staff knew that her pneumonia could be easily treated, and yet they were inhibited and prohibited from treating it. So these are all examples of things that create this sense of moral injury. And it's the distressing psychological behavior and sometimes even spiritual aftermath. And again, it goes against one's own values. I like to define it very simply as a normal human response to an abnormal event. So, something occurs that we're not able to respond the way we wish to. And in this unusual event, we're stuck. And it was originally applied to veterans, and think of veterans who came back who may have done things that they thought were horrible. Maybe they bombed a village that turned out to be the wrong village, or they shot somebody who turned out to be a child. But it can affect police, it can affect emergency workers, defense attorneys, child protective workers, so many of us in different situations. So, some examples of this can be, following or giving orders that one perceives are illegal, accidentally or knowingly killing non-combatants, giving orders that result in unnecessary deaths. One of my counseling cases a number of years ago was a man well into his 70s, and was still healthy, but really was struggling with an incident that happened in World War II. At the end of World War II, he had just finished college. He was a newly commissioned lieutenant, sent to the European front. And as they were fighting the Germans in that point in time, he was constantly felt he was being challenged by a sort of veteran sergeant who was always saying, maybe we ought to do this, Lieutenant, or maybe we ought to do that. And he ordered a particular charge up across an area, and the sergeant suggested an alternative way of doing it, and he felt his authority was being challenged, and he said, even at the time I recognized it was a better idea, but I really felt my authority was being challenged, and his platoon was basically wiped out, and of course he had to deal with the tremendous sense of guilt, really, and dealt with it probably for about 50 years before he sought help. But it was giving him nightmares and all kinds of, actually it was creating post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Another case can be a police officer treating, or maybe not treating, a wounded suspect charged with killing another officer. Either way, there's part of you that wants to say, I don't want to touch this guy. He killed my partner, and there's another part of you that feels bad if you do, and feels bad if you don't. Another case could be a defense attorney successfully pursuing a non-guilty verdict of a client he knows is guilty and dangerous. That was one of my clients as well. Having to ration care during a pandemic. It was interesting, a number of years ago, when the swine flu pandemic was, which never really occurred, but was being considered a potential threat, the New York State Health Department brought together a number of people to talk about, to be on a committee to talk about response to that. And I was invited to be on that, to talk about how do we set up grief services and what kinds of services might we need. What's interesting to me is we did this for this pandemic years ago, and as far as I know, it disappeared into the files. And I made a couple of queries as we went to this current pandemic, if anybody had ever found that treatment plan, because it would have been actually kind of useful in this one. But one of the questions was that we had to deal with was, if there are so many cases that need ventilators, and there are only so many ventilators in New York, how do we ration care? All these kinds of things where we experience a sense of moral injury. Another example would be a child protective worker returning a child to a parent he strongly or she strongly believes is abusive. A number of years ago, I had a situation like that too, where I was working with, I was a consultant to an agency, again, on grief issues, and then often did some counseling with staff on related issues. And there was a young girl who, 14-year-old girl, who had been molested by her uncle, who fled to the Dominican Republic, and she was HIV positive. And she was the parent child in her family. Her mother was really, depressed, problematic. The mother, I never met the mother or interviewed the mother, but the mother evidently was not capable of raising this child. Her own problems were overwhelming, and the child really took care of the mother. And ultimately, it came down to a family court decision where this judge thought, well, if this child wants to be with her mother, and again, even though it was very clear the reason she wanted to be with her mother is in the midst of her own disease, she still felt a responsibility to take care of her mother, then she should return there. And this was in the early years of the HIV pandemic, when most people didn't live that long with the disease. And so much against the recommendations of the social work agency, of the social worker, of all the experts that testified, this judge, who obviously or seemed to come from, had a very warm view of family life and mothers, projected his stuff on that family and returned the daughter to a very dangerous situation, where she wasn't really being led to follow her regimen, and she died within 6 weeks of that return, when she probably could have lived subsequently a lot longer, had she been in a situation like a foster home, where they provided very good care. So these are all examples of the kinds of things that can create this moral injury. And again, the consequences here are similar to what we talked about. It can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, suicidal ideation, substance abuse. It's often characterized by guilt, by shame, by anger, by feelings of betrayal. The court system is not standing behind us. It can result in all kinds of family conflicts, staff conflicts, spiritual struggles. And now Deborah Grassman says when spiritual struggles really predominate, she tends to use a slightly different term. I'm not sure it's that distinct, but I'll talk about it for a few minutes, that she calls soul injury. So to her, soul injury is, I just wanted to say, I just want to make this one comment before we get there, that since there's an overlap with post-traumatic stress disorder, treatments for post-traumatic stress disorder have had some success, as had cognitive behavioral therapy and cognitive processing therapy. And then other therapeutic techniques, such as forgiving self, apportioning and examining blame, reviewing, adjusting, and or recommitting to values, are being researched. And other interventions might include what we might call rituals of reconciliation. And this comes from some of the work that I've done on using rituals in therapy. And in my work on ritual, and I guess you see my clerical background in there, but I've learned that sometimes we can use various kinds of rituals to treat people and to assist. And a ritual of reconciliation is a ritual designed on either accepting or giving forgiveness. So it may be a ritual where you read a letter to the deceased. And one of the things, for example, that I had that former lieutenant do was I had him write a letter to his soldiers where he talked about his frustrations, his inexperience, his arrogance, and really did a 5-page letter that really said, I was, forgive me, I was young, I was stupid, I was arrogant, I was dumb. And had I done what I should have done and listened to a more experienced man, maybe you'd still be here. And I'm really sorry. And that was an important thing for him to do. So again, we might talk about those a little bit later on, but that would be a ritual of reconciliation. It involves an active doing something, with a goal in mind, and often involves doing what, doing it in a ritual way. In this case, writing the letter, reading it at the World War II Memorial in Washington, and then burning it there as a way to let the message go up into the heavens as he believed it. Other kinds of techniques may be what we call accessing the internalized other. This is a technique that's been used by a number of people and written about by a number of people. I learned it from Nancy Melez, another faculty member at the College of New Rochelle. And this is a wonderful technique. It's kind of a variation of the empty chair technique. So you all know the Gestalt approach of empty chair. You say what you need to say. You imagine the person that you've wronged in an empty chair, and then you speak to him. The variation of accessing the internalized other is that after you do that, you sit in the chair and respond as you believe that person would respond to you. One time that my first use of it, and one of the ones that still brings emotion to me and still brings emotion to my eyes, is a situation where I was dealing with a 14-year-old boy whose father died 3 years before. Father died of cancer, and the last visit to his father, the boy came to see his mother. He was uncomfortable around his father. His father was very weak, and he remembered his father as being this big, strong guy. He was almost skeletal in his appearance. Physically, he was hard to look at, just because of the ravages of the disease. And this little 11-year-old boy wanted to get out of there very, very quickly. And he also had a ball game that he was planning to play in. And as they were leaving, and he was pushing his mother to leave so he could get to his game, his father said, "Come here and give me one more hug." And he said, "Not today, Dad. We're really in a rush." His father died that night. And for 3 years, he carried that guilt. And engaged in different kinds of behaviors in different kinds of ways. I was a really good kid. And so I had him do that accessing the other. And he stood in, he sat in his chair, looked at the chair where he envisioned his father. It's still a hard story to tell. And apologized to his father very deeply. And he said, "Dad, I'm really sorry. And I keep wanting to go back to that day, and I keep wanting to do this, and wish I would have given you that last hug, and and I didn't know you were dying, and I didn't know that would be the last time I would see you." And he was literally crying. As I said, I almost cried telling that story. And then what was remarkable is he sat in the chair. And as he sat in the chair, let's not hear the phone from the other phones. As he sat in the chair, he looked, and he said to himself, basically in his father's voice, he said, "Sport, has that been bothering you for all this time? He said, kid, I know I love you. I know I love you. Again, I thought I sounded this one off too. So, he said, kid, is that what's bothering you? He said, and all of a sudden the boy started laughing, and he said, that's exactly what my dad would have said. And for him, it gave him a sense of reconciliation, and that sense of that moral injury that he experienced was gone. Well, as I said, similar to the concept of moral injury, soul injury is a belief that some transgressive or traumatic event created a sense that they are flawed, defective, or tainted. And Deborah Grassman originally developed this kind of concept working with dying veterans. And often, much like that man that I talked about, that person who was once a young lieutenant, they have a strong sense of self-depreciation and spiritual distress. And there you have to acknowledge and grieve their unmourned losses, and help them to forgive themselves and embrace themselves. And many times this is not unusual with veterans who are dying, because often as we are in the final stages of life, as Erickson talked about and others have talked about, we go through a life review process, and we deal with that. So again, it's easy for these early memories to come up. Think about, for example, when Saving Private Ryan came out, many veterans really, as they watched that movie, re-experienced post-traumatic stress disorder, because it reminded them of it was so graphic and so relatively accurate that it reminded them of the events they had gone through. So just to kind of, give you a sense of this is, the moral agent is perceived to have acted wrongly, the person himself, or maybe they feel that their country or their leader, their commander, operated inappropriately, and sometimes it becomes a kind of spiritual thing, that whoever is responsible for the world, God let this happen. And the soldier in Grassman's work says, I did something terrible, I'm a bad person, or they might say, I'm screwed by a hire, I trusted them literally with my life, but or no God would allow this. And again, the resulting symptoms can be guilt, shame, withdrawal, cynicism, inability to trust, even a loss of faith, and a moral demoralization. So, so these are all kinds of different ways that we can see the varied aspects of moral suffering. And they're also exacerbated by what we might call vicarious and secondary trauma. And vicarious trauma is used similarly to what we're going to describe as secondary trauma, but generally refers less to traumatic symptoms and more to the inexperience of therapists after an empathic engagement with clients. And so what happens is you're dealing with clients who have experienced tremendous difficulties, tremendous ills, disasters, all kinds of things, and then you begin to be affected by that. This quote sort of talks about it. If you sit with evil and suffering long enough, you will begin to show characteristics similar to those of the victims you are trying to assist. So, for example, the only time that I think I ever really experienced this, but I experienced it very intensely, was after 9/11. I was doing a lot of work after 9/11. What I called, sort of with the secondary participants, the people who indirectly suffered. So for example, I worked with police stations and police and firefighters who were not directly impacted, who weren't at the World Trade Center, but obviously who knew people who were, and or sometimes people in offices downtown that weren't affected immediately by the World Trade Center. In other words, their buildings weren't crumbling, but they were sitting there watching people jump out of windows and things like that. And so you begin to hear these stories time and time again. And it ultimately got to a point where I was having dreams of being in Manhattan and sort of like those World War II Japanese airplanes kind of dive bombing on me, which was really a form of vicarious trauma. I had not seen any of that. I was actually fairly vigilant about not trying to watch it on television, but just the vivid stories of my clients and the people I was working with and the briefings I was doing was making me very aware and really affecting me. Secondary traumatization has been used in two ways. Again, the response of caregivers to the suffering or traumatic events of clients and patients, very similar to vicarious traumatization, but it also refers to a person subsequently traumatized by insensitive treatment, by caregivers, by law enforcement, by media, and we can experience that as well. So, so those are some of the kinds of things we can deal with. And what that does is that leads us to a number of different situations. One is compassion fatigue, that we are just we just don't have it in us anymore. We'll look at all of these: burnout, disenfranchised grief. Compassion fatigue was an earlier and to some extent a less stigmatizing way to describe secondary or vicarious trauma, as well as burnout. It's just that we're on empty. We just can't seem to deal with this anymore. Burnout, very similar, but more general. And it's a term referring to occupational stress that we may feel in any different experience. It's characterized by emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, a reduced sense of accomplishment. And, and sometimes it can simply refer to the toll of working with the dying or bereaved, and more general, and generally not associated so much with indirect exposure to trauma. So, it's just the conditions of dealing with the job so much. And then disenfranchised grief is a term that I coined, and it refers to the fact that we grieve losses that are not openly acknowledged by others, that are not socially supported or not publicly mourned. And as caregivers, a lot of our grief can be disenfranchised. People can say, I just had this patient die today, who I really enjoyed, who was a very important person to me. And I just can't get over it. And, and somebody's saying, well, you just can't get that attached to patients. So you're not getting the kind of social support that you need and the social support that you want. So, how can we use this to use, the therapeutic strategies to help build resistance and to facilitate self-care? How can we, go beyond the therapeutic strategies we use for clients to say, how can we help ourselves? And that's really so critical as we deal with this issue in this point in time. I love this cartoon. First of all, we have to acknowledge and assess all the stress we're experiencing. I love this cartoon. This nurse is bending over backwards. Will this be all for tonight, Mr. Pettigrew? And sometimes we often feel that way. And again, we're not just dealing with moral suffering. We're not just dealing with, with disenfranchised grief, but all of us have personal stress and all of us have personal loss. Excuse me. And then we have to deal with organizational stress. I'm assuming that many of you work for organizations that occasionally experience some form of stress or create some kind of stress. Usually if I'm doing this with a crowd, you can hear the snicker and the laugh, like who doesn't? Then you have to deal with the systemic stress. In most fields where, most people feel that you, beyond simply the organizational stress that people experience, you don't have the, how would we call it? You don't have the resources to deal with the issues at hand. You don't always have the support to deal with the issues at hand. Gilbert, Richard Gilbert, in his work on this, talks primarily about healthcare, about what he calls the loss of sacredness. And what he means by that is, this profession, this sense of idealism that you're in here to save lives and to make people better, is often constrained by the, just the economic and organizational realities. And you have a sense that this idealism that you brought into the field is no longer be recognized. That's been a long time problem. Almost 100 years ago, Ernst Becker, one of the early sociologists of medicine, wrote an article called The Loss of Idealism in Medical School. And you could see how these, idealistic people came into medical school, with all the greatest concerns, and just felt after, by the time that they graduated, that, that their dreams of being as helpful and as patient oriented and as patient centered as they wished were simply, even 100 years ago, or less, slightly less than 100 years ago, not likely to be achieved. He wrote in the 1930s. And then, of course, over time, in whatever field we're in, if we're working with other people, we experience the cumulative losses that take place over time. And Papadatu reminds us that we experience multiple losses. For example, if we're in a medical setting, we not only lose a patient, and you can apply this to whatever setting you're in, we may lose a relationship with the family that, that we had been important to, and they had been important to us. It may remind us of personal, future, or past losses. A number of years ago, I was doing a series of seminars in a nursing home that dealt with nurses' aides. The people who do the bed and body work, the people who are really there and physically and often personally close to patients, the people who feed the patients and the residents. And in this particular nursing home, many of them were women from were Jamaican Americans. And they often, as they talked about their frustrations and their experience as caregivers, talked about, whenever I look at this old woman that I'm taking care of, I think of my mother who's still in Jamaica. And when she's dying, will I get to be there? Will I get to feed her? Will I get to be by her side? Or I wasn't able to be by her side when she died. I wasn't able to go then. We may lose what we call an assumptive world. And that's a very important concept if you're working in trauma. And the loss of an assumptive world means that, we often look, in fact, that's the definition of trauma primarily. The notion of an assumptive world means that we often look at the world as being safe, benevolent, predictable. And of course, one of the things about this pandemic is that it's exactly traumatic because it shattered those assumptions. The world's not predictable. The world's not necessarily safe, and the world's not necessarily benevolent. If I would have told you a year and a half ago, let's say in October of 1920, that Broadway would close down, movies would close down, schools would be operating remotely, many of you would be working remotely, you would have probably committed me. And yet, we've all been traumatized by this experience that the unthinkable has in fact occurred. So we want to be aware of that. We also may have unmet goals. In case you're wondering about the graphic here, it's not announcing a break or a free chocolate chip cookie to everybody who does their evaluation, but it's reminding me of a particular incident. And the particular incident is that a number of years ago, when I was working at Sloan Kettering, one of our favorite kids was a little boy, Johnny. And Johnny was a 7-year-old with leukemia. This was in the 1970s. And in those days, leukemia was a death sentence. It's still a life-threatening illness now, but more and more, most children, many children, are in fact going into permanent remissions, and so we're doing much better. In those days, the expectation was a child with leukemia would live 1 to 3 years, and so Johnny had leukemia, and Johnny was one of these just rambunctious kids who would sometimes get in trouble, but just had this incurable love of life, even under the worst circumstances, that staff were devoted to him. And one of the things that Johnny loved was chocolate chip cookies. And so, and because the staff loved Johnny, his room was always, it was the only room in the hospital that didn't smell medicinally as many hospital rooms do, but smelled like you were walking into a bakery, because everybody was making cookies for him and everybody was buying cookies for him. And his room actually became sort of a break room. He was more than willing to share the hundreds of cookies he had. And so you'd walk in, and it was the first time I ever had a Mrs. Fields cookie. It was the first time I ever had a series of different kinds of cookies, chocolate chip cookies. And I always remember one nurse coming in with a tin of cookies right literally minutes after Johnny had died. And she sat on the bed with this tin, and she said, I promised I'd make him these. It was a new recipe for cookies. And she said, I promised I'd make it for him. And she said, I just want him to live to taste it. And that to me is symbolic of often the unmet goals that we often have. And sometimes, when clients die, a little bit of ourselves seems to die with them. I am just so tense, I think I'll go down to the ranger station and get shot with a tranquilizer dart. I'm sure many of you have felt that at work, as a result of the moral suffering that you've experienced. In pre-Katrina New Orleans, I remember speaking to 500 critical care nurses in a darkened auditorium. And when I put on this slide, one of the nurses, in a loud whisper, stage whisper, said, "Where the hell is the ranger station?" And I'm sure at times we ask that ourselves. So we need to practice self-care. And I love this cartoon. And least but not last, dear Lord, take care of yourself. If you don't, we're all in trouble. And sometimes we have that sense that we need to take care of ourselves. And the key, I think, is maintaining balance. And Papadatu talks about that. I'm just going to go back and forth here. I probably would have put these slides differently had I thought a little bit about it. Papadatu models a model of caregiver grief is that we have to simultaneously both experience and contain grief. It's like a pendulum that swings back and forth. We have to maintain a kind of sense of balance. If we're over-involved, the client may feel overwhelmed and we may burn out. If we're too detached, the client feels rejected and our practice becomes robotic. So we have to do that. And of course, over-involvement can be evident in lots of things. We start making accusations and threats, depending who's around. We take sides. We care more about the problems than the family does. And basically the problem becomes your problem. A number of years ago, I was involved in a program where we were, it was a truancy prevention program, and we were working with kids anywhere from 10 to 12, really the late years of grammar school, early years of middle school, who were already showing significant truancy issues, which was hard to believe when you're looking at a 9-year-old who just refuses to go to school. And I remember really, really getting over involved in that, and I realized at one point in time that I cared more about getting this kid to class than his teacher did, than the school did, than the parents did, than the kid did. It was that sense of over involvement. It became my problem. And one of the things that I found very helpful was that Hare and Weekland, two therapists, make a distinction between being helpful and being useful. And that's a good way to sort of begin to develop your own philosophy of care. Helpful means you try to help the client solve their issues. Useful. So in other words, you're trying to do everything. Literally, with this one kid, I was picking him up and taking him to school only to find out he was going out another door as soon as he got in. Useful means that you empower clients to solve their own problems. So being helpful often means you're not necessarily being useful. So we have to monitor countertransference. And that's a significant part of it. And if you remember Freud defined countertransference very negatively. Transference was a basic approach in therapy. That we had to examine transference, and the client would look at us as an authority figure and transfer their issues to us. But countertransference was very negative. Countertransference was what you needed to go into therapy yourself to avoid, where you would essentially transfer your emotions and reactions to the client. We understand it differently now. We understand that we're going to have reactions that as we work with clients, that they're natural, they're inevitable, and they're not inappropriate. Clients are going to bring up issues in ourselves. However, this is the difference. They need to be understood by the therapist, so it doesn't cloud the therapeutic process. I use the term reflective self-awareness, that you should always be asking yourself, why am I reacting this way to this client? What is it in this client that triggers this feeling or this emotion? So it's not that you're not going to have them, but that you're going to have them and you're going to deal with them, and you're not going to let them affect your treatment of the client. And again, we know that countertransference is higher the longer the length of contact with the client. When the client's characteristics, maybe age, maybe class, maybe gender, are similar to the person who's working with them, or when they have experienced similar issues. And it can be projective identification, where the client mirrors the therapist, or the worker mirrors the client's feelings. They feel hopeless, we feel hopeless. Or objective countertransference, which is just a normal response to a client's behavior. So, if you have a hateful client, you may respond negatively to. If you have a dying child, you may be full of sympathy. But probably the one that really is the most problematic is what we call subjective countertransference. And this is evoked because of a counselor's personal conflicts or their own issues or experiences. This is what Freud really saw as dangerous, and this is what we really should be focusing, not on necessarily on understanding and working with, and maybe just dealing with, even if it's dealing with it under supervision. Let me give you an example of that. I told you a number of years ago, I was consultant to a foster care agency, mostly dealing with pediatric AIDS, but they had another unit under that same vice president, and sometimes that vice president would ask me to consult and intervene in one of these situations. And in one situation, we had an ex-Italian priest. In other words, he was a priest who had literally come from Italy to serve an Italian-speaking parish on Arthur Avenue, an old Italian section of the Bronx. Still get good Italian food there and great Italian bread there. And so he would do an Italian mass there. And what happened is that he fell in love with a young woman there. He asked for and received release from his vows, married that woman, and lived with her in the United States, gained citizenship and lived with her in the United States. But he had abandonment issues. He abandoned his mother in Italy, at least in his mind. He abandoned his mother church. And he was working in foster care with what's called independent living. And in independent living, the goal of foster care is to get help for the family and return the family to return the child to the family. A subsequent goal, because the ultimate goal is permanence, a subsequent goal or a secondary goal, if that's not possible, is of course to free the child up and put him in a situation where he has permanent parents. A third goal used, whenever either of those are for some reason there's an inability to fulfill either of those goals, is what's called independent living. And this is usually used with older children. And you realize that they're probably not going to get adopted, or they're not going to be freed up for adoption. They're not going to return to their home for one reason or another. And so you're training them to live independently. And of course, family relationships change. And if the child's going to be adopted, often the family relationships have been severed, or really not that important to the child, or will be dealt with at the child's later age. Obviously, if you're returning to the family, you want to keep a close connection. But in independent living, the idea is that you're training the child to be independent. And one of those choices is, well, what kind of relationships do I want to have with my parents, and how do I manage that relationship? And in this case, what occurred was that every time he met with his essentially teenage clients, his first question was to them, when did you last call your mother? Why haven't you spoken to your mother? So rather than helping them to make a decision on what kind of relationship they wanted with their biological mother, he was pushing them to have one. Essentially, not even the father. Essentially, he abandoned his mother, and these kids were not going to abandon their mother. And again, these counter-transference feelings can be very raw, upsetting, fully conscious, or they can be subtle and out of awareness. And so the first principle of self-care is to really have reflective awareness, to ask yourself, why am I responding this way to this client? We have to recognize also our own dependency needs. You go into this field to help people, and we really have a need to be needed. I remember my first grief counseling case, the first one I ever dealt with as an intern. And the last question I asked her was, after we had a session together, was, do you think you would like to meet again? And I realized I wanted her so much, and she did say yes. Because, I probably, it would have been much more effective, really, and I would have been more effective if she said, no, I think you really gave me a lot of guidance here, and I think I can do this on my own. And so sometimes, as I said, we want to be needed, and that can interfere. We can create motivations, try to fix the family, the patient's death. And I always remember what one of my, one speaker once said, no one needs to, Edwin Schneidman, no one needs to die in a state of psychoanalytic grace. You don't need, because my field is death and dying, you don't need to die forgiving everybody or being forgiven by everybody. You should die the way you want to die, and you need to die. So what are the principles of self-care? Well, individually, it's validation, that you recognize that, that this situation was troubling. This situation created some suffering in me. We also have to have good respite and stress management. And one of the things that Balford Mount felt was that everybody needs what he called a respite rule. And what he means by a respite rule is that, you just put aside time that you're not going to deal with work, or you create rules that you're not going to deal with work. One of my respite rules, for example, is because I work in grief and loss and disasters and things like that, I never watch movies that bring me back to my work. And, and I have a whole, in a shelf with videos that I have in my house. I have a whole bunch of videos or DVDs that people gave me over the years. They're still unwrapped. And they often give it to me saying, you have to watch this. It's about 9/11. I know you were involved, or you have to watch this. It's about a dying child. And that's the last thing I want to watch. I don't want to go back to that. I'll watch things that are different. We have to have a philosophy, and that includes both a philosophy of the role and a spiritual philosophy, however we define it, whether it's humanistic or theistic. A philosophy of the role is I always say that the complement of compassion fatigue, or the opposite of compassion fatigue, the other side of compassion fatigue, is compassion satisfaction. that we have a sense of saying, I did good today. That really worked. And a sense that one is growing, and a sense that one's work contributes to the well-being of individuals or societies. And Avery Weissman has a wonderful concept here. Avery Weissman's concept is that he calls it least possible contribution. And he doesn't mean do as little as possible. That's not what Avery Weissman means by that. What he means by that is take pleasure in the little you can do. You're not going to be able to fix everyone. You're not going to be able to fix the world, but take notice of those small triumphs. A number of years ago, when I was supervising my own interns at the College of New Rochelle, in what was called the thanatology program, which was a certification within the counseling program that was a specialization in grief counseling persons with life-threatening illness and the like. I had one student who entered, who I was a little worried about in the beginning, and she was an executive who was retiring from the college. She was the assistant to the president, and she was a well-known problem solver. Give her a problem, she found a solution. And I thought, she's going to find herself very frustrated when she's dealing with grieving people and dying people. I wonder how she's going to do it. And I shouldn't have worried, because she found her way through. And one of her patients was a man who's she was working with, who was dying. She was working with, seeing him through the local hospice, and he was living with his son. His son was a substance abuser, and so you couldn't leave any pain medication there because the son would take it. The house was dirty. Two men living there, one ill. Not that men can't be good cleaners, but the son wasn't, this middle-aged son wasn't, and the whole thing was a mess. And when she originally came in, she was gonna get some, maybe a local church to send a cleaning crew in, and all this kind of stuff, and of course nobody was interested. And over time, I thought, I wonder how she's going to react to his death, because she seemed so frustrated. He was also dying of emphysema and lung cancer. And as she said, here's what he'd do. He'd sit there, take a drag of a cigarette, and then take oxygen, go like this, and then this. He said, one of these days, it's going to go like this, and the whole place is going to blow up. But in any case, what she found out is that he liked buttermilk, and she liked buttermilk. Evidently, I've never tasted buttermilk, but evidently it's not a widespread taste. But every day when she came to see him, every time she came to see him, she would bring a pint of buttermilk and then have a glass of buttermilk together. And she, as we debriefed after his death, she said, there were a lot of things that I wished I could have done that I didn't do. But she said, at least we had our buttermilk. And that's what Avery Weissman meant by the least possible contribution, not doing as little as you can, but taking satisfaction in sometimes the very little that you can do. And then we have to have a spirituality. And as I said, it can be theistic or non-theistic. But how does it deal with or explain the unfairness that we see in life? What does it say about personal forgiveness? Are there particular practices or rituals that can help you forgive others and help you forgive yourself? But there's an important point we need to make as well here. And that particular point is that, that really, it's not just individuals. Organizations can facilitate self-care. And sometimes we can be our best advocates and saying we need to do this. Organizations, Balfour Mount and Mary Vachon, and it's interesting to see Vachon and Balfour Mount's research. Two Canadians, one a nurse, one a physician. But Mary Vachon was one of the first people who studied and defined the term burnout. She was at the University of Calgary as a nursing professor of nursing. On the other end of the continent is Balfour Mount, what we often consider the father of palliative care. And he was looking at resilience in people who work with the dying. And his sample consisted of people who had worked 25 years or more with the dying and still said, still said, I really enjoy the work I'm doing. So that was how you got into a sample. 25 years, and you still like going to work every day, working with dying people. And so they looked at these issues, and they both found the same thing. They both found the same principles of self-care. In one cases, they were done. In resilience, and in burnout, they weren't. But they also found the same organizational elements. Again, organizations that did these facilitated resilience. Organizations that failed to do this facilitated burnout. First was education, that they provided ongoing education for your staff. And I hope the time you're taking today is being credited by your organizations. And they're, because hopefully you've learned maybe some new things, some new concepts that'll help you get through some frustrating situations. Second of all, these organizations provided support, both informally and formally. One of the things that we did when I worked with this foster care agency with pediatric AIDS, now we had social workers and nurses. Most of our nurses, this was in the late 70s, early 80s, when that pandemic was at its very beginnings, and one of the things that we ended up doing was at this agency was setting up support for staff. There was a social worker team, social worker nurse team. Most of the nurses, by the way, because the city was going through financial issues, were nurses who had worked in schools, school nurses who were being laid off because of the city's financial problems. So most of them had great experience with kids, but not necessarily with ill kids for the most part. Most of the social workers, as one of them said to me as we talked, the death of a child was a career marker. You'd say you had kids in foster care, you'd say, yeah, and 20 years ago, I had a kid run in front of a car and get hit. So they were, now they were dealing with children who were dying regularly. In the first years of the pandemic, pediatric AIDS statistics were something like this: a third of the kids died in 6 months. Third of the kids, from birth died by 1, and by 3, virtually all of them were dead. Happily, those figures became much better over the years, but they were pretty stark in the early days. So we used to have support groups for the staff. That was a way of showing formal support. And the way it worked out was about a third of the staff came every week. A third of the staff, and then not every week, but bi-weekly, a third of the staff came in crisis, and a third of the staff basically never came. And so after a year, we had to do an evaluation. And one of the questions was, how useful was the support group? And my expectation was that a third would say very, a third would say somewhat, and a third would say not at all. Almost everybody said very, almost 100%. And then we went back and we said, well, if it's that important, why did you never go? Without not saying it in a threatening way, but just in a curious way. And the answer we got was very interesting. They said, I'm not a support group person, but the fact that the agency provided a support group said they acknowledged my loss. The second thing that, another person, I can't think, it was Gary Adams, I think was his name, did research on our agency, which he called support centered, and another agency he called bureaucratically centered. Now you can imagine in the city of New York, when a child dies in foster care, there are reams of paperwork to do. And in these reams of paperwork, there's, because the agency has to protect itself. Now, that wasn't changed even when we were dealing with kids whose life expectancy was expected to be very low, or unfortunately. And so he looked at where morale was the highest. Well, you could probably predict that morale was the highest in our agency, and it was. We had much higher morale than them. Then the second question was, which organization is more efficient in doing the paperwork? I wish I could see you and ask you to show of hands how many of you thought it was the bureaucratically centered and how many of you thought it was the support centered. But if you answered support centered, you would be right. Because you can stare at an empty piece of paper a long time if you feel you're not getting supported. And lastly, it's important to have rituals, to note different events, to note different times, to note losses, maybe just to gather staff together. And that was very, very important. We used to encourage staff to go to the funeral, but we realized and give them time off for doing that if one of their children died. But we also realized we needed to have our own ritual at home because in the agency, whenever a child died. And then, of course, organizational support can include just regular debriefings. How was this experience for you? How could it have been done differently? Ethical grand rounds. And again, critical incident stress debriefings or other related techniques may be useful. There's, whatever helps us get through this. Papadopoulos' formula is that we need to connect with self, focus on ourself. We need to connect with others. Whatever our spirituality is, we need to spiritually center. Good advice. And finally, I will leave you with the advice of Frank and Ernest, and then we'll go on to questions and answers. But Frank and Ernest also give good advice. My therapist says I should be my own best friend, but I refuse to lower my standards that much. Lower your standards, become your best friend. And I look forward to your questions now. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Dr. Doka. As always, enlightening information. We have several questions, so I'm going to start. Do you think that family members who do not agree with a loved one's medical directive can experience moral distress? And what are some ways to help these family members?
Yeah. We often focus the term moral distress on professional staff. So maybe we need a slightly different word, but certainly they're experiencing whatever you want to call it. And I would call it moral distress, to be very honest with you. I think, I think the first thing we need to do is get an assessment of the family. There are some, who was it? War and Peace. I just can't think of the author of that. Help me. Who's the author of War and Peace? PJ?
I don't know. I know the book. I've seen the movie.
Oh, it's a very famous author, Russian author. Anyway, he makes the comment in there, all happy families are the same. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Something to that effect. And I think there's a great truth in that. So I think the first thing is we need to do is to assess the family. Is this a family that generally functions well, or is it a family that really has conflictive relationships? Where if I say potato, you say potato, that kind of thing. So we need to know what kind of family we're dealing with. We may need to, if it's productive, to have family meetings where we try to, and you know how to do family meetings, or you can get trained how to do family meetings if you've never done them before. But you gather the family together, you make sure everyone has the same information, and you process their questions, and hopefully you can reach a consensus. And then, of course, I think the other thing too is to preventive is to try to reach that consensus on the directives before they need to be applied. First thing I did was shared my directives with my son when I did them, and went through them and talked about my choices. And I said, ultimately, though, I give you permission to make your choices. I want you to be comfortable with your decisions. So whatever we do on that. And then in other cases, it just may be that you have to do one of two things. That one thing is, of course, to give time to reach consensus. When my mother was dying, she had taken a fall, and there was a question of taking her off support, and we all talked about it, and my brother wasn't quite ready, and we'll say, well, and we just asked, I had the directive, but he wasn't quite ready, and we just said, well, we're going to wait a day. I said, how long do you want to wait, Frank? And he said, let's give it through the weekend. I want to go up on the weekend and see her. And actually, ironically, he was there on Sunday morning when in fact she did die. So sometimes just, giving time for the family to process things can be important. And then sometimes you're just not going to reach consensus in some families. And then you have to provide, what I would consider to be sort of supportive care after. Not every situation is going to end well. That's why we have a lecture on moral suffering. Sometimes you're going to have family members, even when you go through this entire process and have family meetings and give them time, you can count on the fact that there's going to be, in some families, one member is going to turn to you when they leave and say, "You killed my mother." Hopefully with good process, that won't happen often, but I would never pretend it won't happen.
Dr. Doak, I'm just going to ask you to advance to the evaluation QR code while we ask the next question.
Sure.
And
Okay.
all of our
And
participants
remember, I love you. Yes.
all of our participants have responded with Leo Tolstoy is the author of War and Peace.
Oh, Leo Tolstoy. Thank you so much.
Okay, so we have another question.
At least we know everybody's listening.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Next question. From an ecological approach adopted by Jack Saul concerning moral injury, would Darnella Frazier, the young woman who filmed George Floyd's arrest, who reports that she stays up some nights apologizing to George Floyd for not doing more, would this be an example of moral injury?
I think it would be, yes. Yes, I think it would be that, that she looks back and she thought, I wonder if what if I said stop? What if I said I'm filming you? Yeah, I think that even though she was just a bystander, not in a professional role, I think that's a clear example of moral injury, a terribly unfortunate one. And I hope, that she gets the help that she needs, to really explore her feelings and again, if she feels she needs it to at least give a sense of self-forgiveness. She may recognize that there was probably very little she could have done, but she, that may be a process where she comes out and says, yes, I couldn't have done anything else. I wouldn't have been listened to. I wouldn't have been heard. Or she comes out and says, I wish I would have done it differently, and I will recommit to do it differently the next time, if there ever is a next time. And I will have to forgive myself for this time, whatever that conclusion of that process is for her.
Okay. So another question. Could you speak more about ritual within the office?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's no, again, depending on the office, ritual is a very important tool. When I talk about ritual, have you ever read The City in History?
No, I haven't read that one.
That's by Lewis Mumford. I remember that author.
Okay.
Okay. The City in History was a book that came out in the 60s when we were, really interested in urban renewal. Fascinating book about how cities evolved and stuff. But one of the points that Mumford makes in the beginning is, kind of a cute little comment, but I often think it has great significance. And he says the first permanent settlements of humanity in Neolithic times were where nomadic individuals would return to the same places every year to reverently bury their dead, often carrying their dead with them. So the first cities were cemeteries, so to speak. The first permanent settlements were cemeteries. And of course, the point he's trying to make in the book is unless we really work on pollution and the issues, that they're going to end up as being cemeteries again. That was his sort of opening analogy. But the point is that from our, that years and years ago, we recognized the viability, of ritual even before we could write about it. We recognized how important it was. And I think there are times, and every office does rituals. They probably have a party for people who are departing, or or maybe take the new person out to lunch or something like that. But sometimes we need rituals that help us get through crises. One of the things, for instance, that I did with an agency in 9/11 that was across the street from it, is when they were starting to return back, we did a ritual of purification. To say, okay, this space, once not so safe, is now safe again. At least we hope it's safe again. So yeah, I think we, and again, the point of a ritual is that it has to be created to deal with the story that needs to be told. So there's no one ritual to do for this, but you have to say, okay, what does the narrative tell us? What do we need? Do we need a ritual of purification? Do we need a ritual of reconciliation? Do we need to honor an employee who's died? Maybe a former boss or maybe a former employee. What do we need? And then what should be part of that ritual? And ritual always includes tangible as well as intangible things. Tangible things with intangible meanings. So maybe we, I know one woman who was struggling with taking off a wedding ring, and she decided to take it off and make it into a locket, a gold locket with a picture of her spouse. And so as she says, he's still with me. He's close to my heart. But she was a middle-aged woman. But now, I feel I can date again, and now I feel I'm in a different place in my life journey. So again, we have to create these rituals personally, but I certainly think that offices are appropriate places for them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Doka. I think we have time for one more question. How can we encourage post-traumatic growth from moral injury?
Oh, wonderful question. We could do a whole session on that. Really, because it is a very important, and post-traumatic growth is a term that comes out of the work of Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun. So for those of you who want to look at it, and I think the best way to do that, just very, very simply, but there's a lot more I could say. I mean, literally, we could literally spend a session on post-traumatic growth. But I think simply is to look back and to say, what have we learned from this event? What will we do differently? What skills do we need that we don't have? And then to look forward and say, and how do we reach that state? And how can we? How will this change how we run as an organization? We've learned to appreciate each other more through this event. But how do we acknowledge that? How do we recognize that? So again, I think I always call it the Janus approach, looking backward and looking forward, and Catherine Sanders asked 3 questions, which I think are really, we're in a new place now. We've grown through this event, as terrible and as awful as it was. What do we want to take from our old life into our new life? What do we need to leave behind? Maybe some of the anger and some of the bitterness, and what do we need to add? And I think that's that looking forward and looking backward is really the way to achieve something, to achieve that post-traumatic growth as individuals and as organizations.
So maybe we'll look at doing a whole session just on that. I might take you up on that.
It's a great area. Yeah.
I'm probably going to squeeze in one more question because we have a couple minutes, but if this is too big of a question, just tell us, Dr. Doka, and we won't do this. What is the difference between moral injury and PTSD?
Well, basically, moral injury is the sense that that you have experienced something that moral injury is sort of a perceived an event that you perceive as morally problematic. PTSD, depression, a whole series of responses can be potential consequences of it. So I would say it really is that moral injury is a cause, and how that event becomes how it becomes a consequence in given people who experience it can be different. But certainly we know that one of those consequences can be PTSD.
So I think that takes us to the hour. Dr. Doka, as always, lots of comments in the chat box about how wonderful your presentation was and how valuable the information was. Again, please complete the survey. It is how we get our funding to be able to offer these webinars free of charge and to have this wonderful presenter, Dr. Doka, come and join us.
Oh, thank you.
And
I'm going
we
through the
hope
chat
that-
box and seeing all the Tolstoys listed.
Yes, everybody responded to you with that one.
Thank you so much. And I was going to
So-
say and I can't even pronounce it right now, Dostoevsky or whatever. I was thinking of Crime and Punishment there. I was trying to think of a Russian author. Thank
So
you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Doka. And again, we hope you will join us for our next series next week. And we wish you all luck and take care of yourselves and have a great day.
Take care.
Take care, everybody.